For Pacifica Radio, May 22nd, 2016. I'm Scott Horton. This is Anti-War Radio. All right, y'all, welcome to the show. I'm Scott Horton. This is my show, Anti-War Radio, here every Sunday morning from 8:30 to 9 on KPFK 90.7 FM in L.A. You can find my full interview archive, more than 4,000 of them now, going back 13 years, at scotthorton.org. And you can follow me on Twitter, at Scott Horton Show. Today's guest is Phil Giraldi. He is a former DIA and CIA officer. He's executive director of the Council for the National Interest at councilforthenationalinterest.org. And he writes regularly at UNZ.com, that's UNZ, UNZ.com, and the American Conservative magazine, theamericanconservative.com. Welcome back to the show. How you doing?
I'm fine, Scott. How are you?
I'm doing real good. Appreciate you joining us on the show today. Good to talk to you as always. And very important piece that you've written here. I hope that people really take a good look at it. Clinton's hawk in waiting. And this is the kind of thing where maybe we're asking a lot of people to say, hey, you know what, besides the cast of characters at the top, it's really important that you start to learn who's the Deputy Secretary of State for lying us into war and who's the special assistant to the ambassador to the United Nations and God knows what, because these people have so much power and influence, unaccountable power and influence, really. And you really make the case here about Hillary's hawk in waiting, Victoria Nuland. Who's Victoria Nuland?
Well, Victoria became better known. She's the Assistant Secretary of State for Eurasia and Europe, which means that she has a mandate for Europe and also Russia and much of Western Asia. And she became well known when she used an obscenity to describe the Europeans in a phone conversation in the Ukraine, and basically she was using an expletive to say that we should dismiss the European considerations or interests. And she was also, of course, the heavy hand behind overthrowing the regime of Yanukovych, who was basically a friendly to Russia, in an attempt to promote regime change in Ukraine to make it pro-European and pro-Western and pro-American. And so anyway, she was that's where she became well known, but she's been a figure that some of us have been aware of for quite some time, as she is a Dick Cheney protege originally, extremely hawkish, and also a protege of Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Man, that's a bad thing to be two proteges of. Hillary and Dick. Well, and she's married to Robert Kagan, the author of Benevolent Global Hegemony, which is a beautiful euphemism for American empire.
Yeah. Robert Kagan, of course, is a well-known neoconservative. That's her husband, and he has been one of the early neoconservatives to come out and indicate that they are thinking or they are going to vote for Hillary Rodham Clinton. So this thing fits together all very nicely. And then when you throw into the hopper the fact that there is another Kagan brother, Fred, who is married to Kimberly, who heads the Institute of War, it all kind of fits that this is the first family of military intervention, and it's interesting how their power kind of works in a circle. They define the policies. The policies then get picked up by the people who are inside the government, and then the wheel continues to turn, and it becomes like a self-justifying system where the policies are never really challenged, and these people, meanwhile, are inside the system like a hamster running around, a cage, and it generates lots of money. It generates access to the media, and it's a very, very dangerous situation.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to believe until you learn all about it. The first time I ever learned about Victoria Nuland was in the article years ago, and I had forgotten. I had to go back and went, oh, wow, this was her, huh? It's the article All in the Neocon Family by Jim Loeb, who's I would say the world's foremost expert on the neoconservative movement, if there is a single one. And he talks about how, really, the entire neoconservative movement meets for Thanksgiving dinner at one big table because they're all intermarried. There's only a few dozen of them in the world. And, here it is, Kagan's wife, and as you say, bridging the divide between the Republican and Democratic parties in power and this kind of thing. Working for Cheney, working for Hillary, same difference either way.
Yeah, and they're in the think tanks too. I mean, one of them is in Brookings, and the other one is in American Enterprise Institute. And as I say, they have their own institute, which is the Institute for the Study of War. And the ideas, they have all these people on the payroll, and they come up with these ideas that are, of course, from the perspective of you and me, ridiculous. But these ideas, nevertheless, in Washington have currency about how America should be exercising power. They all believe that America has the responsibility to use military power. We're not talking about soft power here. We're talking about military power to bring democracy to the world and to make all these places a lot more like Peoria.
Mm. Well, yeah, that's the excuse anyway, but emphasis on the first part, making sure the military is powerful enough to do whatever they think their agenda is.
That's right.
And of course, Obama, was famously walking around with Robert Kagan's book and meeting with him for lunch and promising that, almost like David Petraeus and Max Boot, will you please go back and tell the other guys that I'm cool, despite whatever rumors are going around about my Islam or whatever?
Well, Fred and Kimberly were, in fact, the court historians for Petraeus. They used to follow him around in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they wrote a hagiography of him, basically describing how he's the greatest general since Napoleon.
He only lost 2 wars, Phil. What's your beef?
Well, Napoleon eventually lost too. Come on, but the fact is that these people are deeply embedded in the power structure, and they are dangerous. And if Hillary Clinton is elected president, I would certainly expect to see Victoria Nuland popping up at a senior position in the bureaucracy, maybe at the very top of the bureaucracy. We're talking maybe Secretary of State, maybe National Security Advisor, or something like that.
Yeah, can you imagine? All right, now, so let's go back to this coup here. And as you say, what made her famous, a household name or whatever like that kind of thing, is this audio that was leaked. I guess, apparently, as you say in the article, apparently intercepted by the Russians, but we don't know for sure, but where she says, F the EU. And, of course, everybody said, oh, my goodness, a diplomat using the F word was the news story, according to CNN. But, in fact, the audio was of her and Jeffrey Pyatt, the ambassador to Ukraine, plotting a coup d'etat. And so
that's right.
My question for you, though, is, why F the EU? Because wasn't the whole thing that they wanted to get rid of Yanukovych and replace him with Poroshenko and Yats and whoever because Yanukovych had balked at the last minute when they changed the terms of the EU trade deal in order to make it exclusive and forbid him from entering a like agreement with the Russians?
Well, the European ministers basically were not in favor of as aggressive an approach as our friends were pursuing. They didn't really want anything to go to the point of a violent change of government or a takeover of government, because after all, Yanukovych was elected legally in a fair election, basically, and the fact is they wanted a more balanced transition. Now, of course, Victoria was against that. She was basically, as you note, plotting a coup, and she was even conspiring with the U.S. ambassador to pick out the guy who would take over. I mean, this should have really driven Americans crazy to hear that we're doing this sort of thing overseas, but she kind of got away with it. I expected in the aftermath of it that Obama would have to fire her, but he didn't. And in fact, as far as I know, he never really even made a comment directly addressing what had taken place. I mean, this is kind of outrageous. It's absolutely incredible.
Yeah. Well, And, it's important to point out that, maybe the coup was successful in the sense that they got rid of the last guy, but the plan, as described by Gideon Rose, who is not a government official, but he is the editor of Foreign Affairs, and when he described what was going on the Stephen Colbert show, he didn't say, oh, I think, maybe, or anything. He was making it very clear what was going on was that while Putin was distracted with the Olympics, they were going to try to steal Ukraine and get away with it and create a situation where it would be such a fait accompli that he wouldn't be able to react. Nothing bad would happen. It would be a great little thing, and America would sneak off with Russia's girlfriend, basically, was the way that he put it. And, Putin and, Colbert pretend Republican hooting and hollering over it and that kind of thing. And that's not what happened at all. It was a total disaster. The first thing they did was outlaw Russian in the East or whatever and start a war.
Yeah, and this was a project, that Victoria Nuland and Gersman, the head of the National Endowment for Democracy, have been working on. They had spent $5 billion on democratization, which basically meant subversion in Ukraine. And so this was something that was not exactly just off the cuff type movement. And the other thing to bear in mind is that the timing, as you point out, was specifically linked to the Sochi Olympics because it had a double effect in terms of embarrassing the Russians for the Olympic Games. You remember that our glorious leader boycotted any official U.S. government presence at the Olympic Games. So obviously this was part of another game playing out.
Yep. And, to Gideon Rose's credit, he's actually run at least two very, kind of thorough debunkings of the policy in Foreign Affairs in his own journal since then, one by John Mearsheimer, that saying this was absolutely all America's fault. So at least he's willing to eat a little bit of crow. But if you see the Colbert episode from, it was like the night before the coup, it was 2 nights after. So it was February the 24th, 2014. His little interview on the Colbert Show, where he gloats about this great success, his mission accomplished moment. But at least he's run a couple articles, kind of saying, "Okay, yeah, that didn't work out so well."
Yeah, it's kind of reminiscent of. I was talking with some people yesterday about the Syrian situation with the use of chemical weapons. We have one of these situations where everything is phony, and it kind of smells bad, and it's phony, and then suddenly the whole story kind of unravels. And, there's been a lot of that kind of stuff lately.
Yeah, especially when it comes to Russia issues, right? This is the thing with Georgia in 2008, where I think at the very end of November, the beginning of December, so let's see, September, October, 4 or 5 months later, the New York Times ran a thing on their front page called, "Oh yeah, sorry, we lied our asses off about who started the war in Georgia. It was Georgia who started it." And the Russian military was simply defending their peacekeepers that they had there under a deal with the United Nations and the approval of the United States of America. So, oops, sorry about that.
Yeah, it's as you say. I mean, these stories tend to unravel, but the fact that strikes me as incredible is that, in spite of this is like our 5 or 6 military interventions over the last 15 years, all of which were failures. And the same thing is true of these stories when they kind of float them, and I guess they know there's a gullible media out there that's going to pick these stories up and replay them, but it's always a matter of time before the thing starts to come apart. And you wonder how stupid whoever it is in the White House that dreams up these things in the first place. But this is a prime reason why Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are as successful as they are, because you look at these situations, you realize you're being lied to all the time.
Right. Yeah, that was the reason so many people were willing to go from zero to libertarian when it came to Ron Paul back a few years ago, was because no matter what this guy says about whatever issue that I may or may not agree with his opinion on the policy, people thought, he's not lying to me. I know he's not lying to me. He's telling me at least his best estimate of the truth every single time. And boy, is that, like a ray of sunshine in the darkness compared to the nonsense that you get most of the time. No doubt about it.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the government really is in the business of peddling lies, and it's become in our lifetimes the norm.
Yeah.
And
I mean, as you said, there's no way that Bernie Sanders would have any kind of support at all, other than he seems authentic as compared to Hillary Clinton. Right? Both of their policies are completely horrible and almost the same. But he doesn't seem like a damned liar, and she's right there in the dictionary next to, her picture next to the term.
I liked her comment yesterday about the downing of the Egyptian airplane. She basically said this proved that we Americans need to provide the strong leadership in the world to prevent this kind of thing. And I was trying to figure that one out for a long time. What possibly could she have done to
we have to start. We need to have a war on terror, Phil.
We need a bigger war on terror.
And then she said, and correctly, I think she says, Trump's Islamophobia and his proposed ban and whatever plays into the terrorist narrative about America and helps them. But never mind killing them, though. That's perfectly fine. But insulting them with words and proposals for travel bans, that's really going way too far. And here, of course, she's the one who, as we've covered on the show, in the Iraq War, she accidentally helped Bush give all of Western Iraq to Osama and Zarqawi. But then, as Secretary of State, she quite deliberately took the side of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group and basically the Libyan veterans of al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Syrian veterans of al-Qaeda in Iraq in their revolutions. So for her to say that Donald Trump is the recruitment sergeant in the sense that people would react against him and join up, yeah, that's pretty bad, all right. But then again, she is outright guilty of the highest treason in backing these guys, where even in her own words, supporting the revolution in Syria is supporting al-Qaeda in Syria.
Yeah, I mean, I've often said that Trump has no resume, but Hillary does have a resume, and it's all bad.
Right, exactly. He will kill 1 million people. She already has.
That's right.
And will also kill another 1 million, probably. But, yeah.
I would think that's a certainty, yeah.
All right, so let me ask you about this, and maybe I'll get back to Nuland in a second when I think of more to ask you about Nuland. But I'm sure you saw the news that Avigdor Lieberman is now going to be the defense minister, Phil. Not the marginalized, ignored, ceremonial foreign minister. The defense minister of Israel.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's kind of inevitable. Netanyahu has been playing to his own right wing for a long time now. That's where he has solid support, and some of the religious parties have been waffling on him. And it's kind of inevitable. Israel has a regime that would be very difficult to not describe as fascist. In terms of the relationship of the government with the military, and of course the defense minister, the opening came because even the generals were appalled by some of the policies.
Yeah, you heard it here first, folks. Phil Giraldi paraphrasing Martin Peretz.
Yeah, that's right. Never happened again.
Right. I mean, seriously, when even Marty Peretz calls you an Israeli fascist, then that means you have crossed the line.
Yeah.
Well, now let me ask you this, though, because he does say, because he's not Likud, right? He's got a different platform than Likud, and I don't know if he means this or not, but hasn't he said in the past that, no, really, we ought to have a Palestinian state, because he seems to honestly recognize the contradictions of maintaining an apartheid system where Israel has at least de facto annexed all the West Bank, and yet has this unsustainable system where all these people are ruled but without any representation. And he said, no, we should do the swaps and what have you, and give up the West Bank and let them have a Palestinian state between the Green Line and, more or less, and the Jordan River, which is quite different than what Netanyahu has said about over his dead body, right?
Yeah, that's correct. But he has also said that part of that swap would be to swap out the Palestinians who are actually Israeli citizens. So he supported that policy too. In other words, he's interested in a two-state solution with Israel being 99% Jewish, and the Palestinian state being everything left over. I can see the logic of that. I understand why somebody would say that makes a certain amount of sense, but of course it's genocidal on a certain level.
Yeah, I mean an entire new ethnic cleansing campaign to kick all the Arab Christians and Muslims out of Israel.
Yeah, so I would not kind of characterize him as someone who's liberal or leaning in that direction. He's someone basically who's not very smart and is highly. He knows the audience he's speaking to. He's clever. He's pragmatic, and in a way, he sounds like Trump.
Well, he lives on the West Bank right now, right?
Yeah.
That's not too pragmatic. I don't know.
No, that's not. Actually, it's not.
But he's the guy who said, well, maybe Mubarak would like it if we bomb the Aswan Dam, and it was over just a diplomatic insult, right? Where Mubarak wouldn't come to Israel to kiss the ring. He wanted to just meet with someone in Cairo or something.
Yeah, and and he supported policies of stripping Arab Israeli citizens of their citizenship for criticizing the regime, and he supported loyalty oaths, and he's not exactly a model of Jeffersonian democracy.
Well, in fact, he's the guy who proposed beheadings, and apparently with no irony or anything like that. I wouldn't want to mischaracterize a statement like that, but apparently he really meant beheadings for people deemed to be traitors. That is Arab citizens of Israel who are deemed to be traitors.
Right. Well, he's a Moldovan bouncer from a bar who moved to Israel and latched on to the shall we say the extreme right wing views of many of the people who had come from many alleged Jews who had come from the former Soviet Union. And basically rose to power. He's got nothing in terms of education or in terms of experience that would justify any of this. But politics is all a game of convincing people that something is true when it's not.
Yeah. All right, now, so as foreign minister, they basically just dealt with the defense ministry, or I was reading a thing that said Ehud Barak was basically the de facto defense minister, at least when it came to dealing with the Americans, because he was persona non grata in D.C. He came a couple of times, but they didn't really give him the time of day, that kind of thing. But they can't really treat the defense minister like that now that he's the defense minister, can they?
No, I mean, because the defense minister is front line in all the negotiations that are going on about how much money they're going to get and what kind of equipment they're going to get. So they can't avoid him. And I think that's going to be the case. Plus, Netanyahu pretty much, even whoever was nominally foreign minister, Netanyahu was pretty much running that portfolio.
Yeah. And now, I mean, I don't know if this is just politics. Seems meaningful because it confirms my bias. The outgoing defense minister, who's no dove at all, right? Who is obviously personally himself soaking in blood, who, worked hard to disrupt Kerry's kind of half-ass effort at a peace deal back a couple of years ago and this kind of thing. He has denounced Lieberman and is denouncing Netanyahu and saying, according to the Associated Press here, he is warning of an extremist takeover of the government and all of this. I mean, imagine if an outgoing Secretary of Defense in the U.S. said that the addition of the new Secretary of Defense replacing him meant, oh my God, it's a terrible disruption in our entire system. It's a signpost on the path to hell or what, kind of thing. That's a pretty extreme kind of thing to happen. It doesn't sound like he's just personally upset that he got fired.
No, I think it's much more than that. I think it's the same problem that people like you and me have with what's going on in the United States. We have lousy politicians as a given. But the fact is, you expect that somehow the system will continue at least to work where these people can't take over and make the whole system work in their favor. You always hope for that. And I think in Israel it's the same kind of thought, that basically, even though the whole Netanyahu regime and everything like that has had a very mixed record, most Israelis figure, well, someday he's going to be voted out of office, and the defense ministry and the generals will push back against him to make him be more sensible. But the fact is, I think what the former minister is saying is that we've crossed the line here. We suddenly have a consensus where there isn't going to be any pushback, and what Netanyahu and these people are advocating is going to become basically what we're all about, and it's a pretty scary thought. Yeah.
All right. Hey, one more thing real quick about Kagan and Russia. I meant to bring this up before. Nuland, Kagan, on Russia. That is, I interviewed Mark Perry, who I know you're familiar with, investigative journalist, writing for Politico magazine lately on this topic. And he had his new thing about the generals and Russia policy. But I asked him whether the generals believe their own BS about the rise of imperialist Russia and all of this stuff, or do they kind of admit, maybe off the record a little bit quietly in the lunchroom or whatever, that they know they started it. They know America overthrew the government in Ukraine and started the war against the refuseniks, or the people who refused to accept that, wrong term there, in the East, and that started a war against them and brought the Russians in. Or, I mean, so what's the deal? And Perry said, no, they believe their own nonsense. I mean, if you listen to the officers at the highest levels in the Pentagon talk about Russia, they believe all of their own lies, apparently, other than the very small faction that's debunking it. But that whole fight is all wrapped up in whose doctrine, who gets the money and which general gets their pet projects and whatever. But as far as the vast majority of the Pentagon, he says the groupthink is just solid. Everybody knows that Putin is the new Hitler or the new Stalin or whatever he is, and we must, forward containment or whatever, their new doctrine. They've got to help defend the West from Russia, and that they really believe it. Which, I don't know, what do you think of that? Because it's such obvious nonsense.
Well, I believe it, and Mark Perry is a very good source. In fact, I opened up this morning I don't know if you get the emails from Defense One, which is basically paid for by defense contractors, and it has a lot of information on what's going on at the Pentagon. The lead article is how the Pentagon is preparing for a tank war with Russia.
Jesus.
These people are nuts. They basically, your general today is not a George S. Patton. He's a guy who's a careerist whose ass is glued to his desk chair, and he will do anything, he will say anything to advance his career. They have no ethical grounding whatsoever in terms of, bringing catastrophe to the world. Their sole objective is to play the game as a player in terms of what their part is, and that's it. It's discouraging, but I've heard that from a lot of junior officers, and of course Mark Perry knows it far better than I do.
All right, well, good times. Thanks very much, Phil. Appreciate it.
Okay, Scott. Bye-bye.
All right, y'all, that's the great Phil Giraldi. He is a former CIA officer, but now he's a good guy. And he runs the Council for the National Interest at councilforthenationalinterest.org. He writes for UNS.com and the American Conservative magazine. This one is called Clinton's Hawk in Waiting, about the horrid Victoria Nuland. All right, y'all, and that's been Anti-War Radio for this morning. I'm your host, Scott Horton, here every Sunday morning from 8:30 to 9 on KPFK 90.7 FM in L.A. My full interview archive is at scotthorton.org, and you can follow me on Twitter at Scott Horton Show. See you next week.